Everybody knows mainstream education is totally broken. It's designed to give people jobs that don't really exist and are not going to exist in a few years.
More and more people are recognizing the value of classical education, wondering whether you thought we're kind of in a renaissance moment.
I think absolutely. We're seeing a huge demand. And I really think the moment we're seeing right now in our nation of the breakdown of just civility, I think it comes from this miseducation. And I think that the only way, maybe, right, to save the republic is to re-embrace classical education just as education.
Well, it's great to have you. I'm here with Jeremy Wayne Tate, the founder and CEO of the Classic Learning Test. It's really great to have you, Jeremy, and thank you for visiting Thomas Aquinas College once again.
It is like Rivendell here. I love TAC. If I could do life over and go back to being a senior in high school, I think I'd be coming here for sure. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's just uplifting to the soul to spend a day here.
Great. Well, it's not too late. You know, we have had students that come back when they're older. We once had someone who graduated when they were 60. So wow. It's possible. I mean, you could try to talk your wife into
That's
that.
Right. That's right.
I thought maybe we could just start by talking about the Classic Learning Test and the kind of the context that's in. I know you've talked a lot about teaching to the test and how the SAT and the College Board, that attitude of teaching to the test has negatively impacted kind of education in America. I wonder if you could tell us more about that. Like why does the test affect education rather than just being an instrument of testing?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, so the SAT has a long history behind it. It actually it was first released in 1926. And when it was released, the SAT was just an aptitude test. It was a cognitive test, almost like you would think of a puzzle. In fact, they would say, you can't study for this test, right? And so the old SAT, the old SAT, it really didn't drive curriculum. The ACT launched in 1959, and they launched with a critique of the SAT. And they said that what the SAT is doing isn't fair. Students shouldn't be tested on innate cognitive ability. They should be tested on what they learn in the classroom. And when people hear that, they say, yeah, that makes sense. The problem is which classroom? Right? Are we talking about a public school, a Jewish day school, a Catholic school, a classical school, Montessori school? It became clear over time that both the SAT and ACT, as they started fighting for essentially market share, were going after the biggest piece of the pie, which was the public schools, right? And so that became very formalized in 2015 with the SAT and ACT both formally and publicly aligning with the Common Core standards. What this means is going to be a big favor towards what they call informational text over fiction or classics. And so you can see the way, I mean, and even in the Common Core standards, right? I think that it was by junior or senior year that no more than 20% of text in English could be fiction. And
really?
You think of anybody you know who loves reading, and almost everybody who loves reading because of great stories,
right?
Because of great books. And not because of having to read informational text, right? And so it's really this kind of soulless vision, I think, for education that the SAT and ACT are now kind of championing. And that's where we saw there was a demand for a third option.
Yeah, okay, great. So, yeah, I mean, Thomas Aquinas College is one of the earliest adopters of the CLT. And, you know, when we were thinking about it, we were saying, well, it's great to have an alternative. We were, you know, it was not too long before we had COVID, and it was a great alternative. And we knew that the SAT becoming kind of more and more woke. But it's great to have that bigger picture, because you're saying there's a lot more at stake than just kind of a woke test. It's really, it's helping shaping the curriculum at
in schools. A huge way. Yeah. You know, and I love to go back and look at, you know, there's a 1869 Harvard College entrance exam that was really the exam that was in place for decades. And basically students are just translating passages into Greek and Latin. But what that did is it shaped the education up to Harvard. You weren't going to Harvard if you didn't master Greek and Latin. So that shaped a grammar school education up until that point. And I think that principle, and in fact, CLT, we try not to take a position at all in terms of if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's debatable that the test inevitably drive the curriculum. But our thought was, well, if it's good or bad, it seems like it's a statement of reality that the tests do that. They do have this effect. And that if it is a statement of reality, the only thing you can really change is the test itself. And so that was our idea. And instead of, censoring, really, I mean, the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is what the SAT and ACT have been doing for a long, long time, our thought was, what if you make this front and center instead?
Yeah. Okay. So, but was the intention from the very beginning seeing the CLT as a lever for change in the curriculum, or did over time you realized how important it was in driving the curriculum?
Like, I think the CLT idea was very much a God moment. I'm not kidding. I hadn't thought all of this out, but I was, I was disillusioned teaching in public schools. I taught in inner city New York. And then I was very excited to get into a Catholic school. When I got into a Catholic school, I saw the influence of the college board there. And I've had a chance to share that story with some TAC visitors today about the way students were unwilling to take elective classes in philosophy or Christian apologetics because it wasn't college board AP. And then the way my wife remembers it, John, she said, I started screaming in the shower one day. And she said, what is the matter? And I said, you could change education with a test. And it was kind of an epiphany moment. Wow. And then I think it went from just kind of a wild dream to people, especially places like Thomas Aquinas, believing in the vision for it. There's a catch-22 when you start a standardized test. And the catch-22 is basically this, is that you can't have a test nationally normed or standardized until you have tens of thousands of test takers. But you also can't get tens of thousands of test takers until it's already nationally normed or standardized. There'd be no reason to take it. And so what we were able to do is get colleges like Christendom, University of Dallas, Benedictine, Grove City to tie CLT scores to scholarships, even when we were young and kind of in our infancy. And if colleges like TAC hadn't done that, no way would we be around today.
Yeah, okay, great. And so is one of the aims of the CLT to, I mean, how far does it go in terms of influencing education? So if you're picking passages for the test and you have passages from Aristotle or St. Thomas Aquinas, which I think you have on your tests, is the idea if those become part of the test, then teachers are going to have to talk about Aristotle, or they're going to have to introduce text from St. Thomas Aquinas to their students? I mean, is that part of the vision?
Yeah, and I always say, if you consider it, as a hypothetical, if we imagine for a minute that the SAT and ACT in their century that they've had, if they had always been tests, where students knew, all right, this is where you're going to have to showcase your ability to grapple with Aristotle or something from Plato's Republic or Dante, that would reshape what's happening in the classroom. Administrators would be looking at it. Teachers are looking at it. Parents are looking at it. So I think it does have that kind of power. And this is what we've seen played out over the years, is that when a school goes from College Board to CLT, it's never by itself. And so typically what they do is they chuck the public school textbooks. They limit use of the calculator a lot in math. I love talking about the math side of this because we've kind of forgotten, that math is formative. Math is a liberal art. And that it's not just about getting the right answer. And so the SAT allowed for a calculator beginning in the late 90s, and suddenly a whole generation became dependent on a device. And the calculators went mainstream in the 70s. But it was really the SAT saying, can't use a calculator on the SAT, where it didn't become the mainstream practice in the classroom. Students still had to learn to do mathematics in the old formative way that they had for all of history before that.
So you're saying that the use of the calculator being allowed on the test paved the way to widespread use in the classroom?
100%. 100%.
Yeah, okay,
and in fact, there was one college, and it was Thomas Aquinas College, that was the most vocal in the building days of CLT on the math side of having no calculator. And so we would even tell parents, if a parent would call and they would be upset that we had no calculator in the math, we'd say, hey, call Thomas Aquinas College.
Right. Well, yeah, as you know, we have a pretty rigorous math program, but yeah, we don't have calculators. And, all our freshmen study Euclid's Elements for a year, demonstrating, theorems of geometry on the board from Euclid. And, I think one thing our students find is that when they do that, you have these kids that hated math in high school, and now suddenly they're falling in love with math. And yeah, I think there's something really fresh about Euclid, something without a calculator where you're going back to like first principles. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, I generally didn't like school growing up, and I remember asking my math teacher, Mrs. Copeland, in 7th grade, like, why do we got to learn this? And she would say, well, it's going to be on the test. And I'd say, no, like, why is it on the test or in your class? Like, why do we need to do this? And she'd always say, well, you're going to use it one day. And I remember thinking, I don't think so, you know?
you're going to use a calculator.
Yeah, yeah. Or I'm just not gonna,
Yeah.
use math. And the truth is, I don't. And most people don't use math in any serious way. And throughout their day, some people do, but many people do not. And so that idea of like you're gonna, they do the same thing with languages, right? You're gonna use Spanish, you're gonna use French, and as a student, well, everybody I know speaks English, and I don't want to go anywhere else, so I'm not gonna learn it. Rather than thinking, no, the language is gonna do something to you.
Right.
Mathematics is going to do something to you. It's going to impress on your heart and soul and mind the beauty and order and truth in the universe.
Yeah, that's a great segue into thinking about another. I think you're suggesting another aspect of the test is shifting away from literature towards just practical, more technical subjects. Is also an indication of a shift of education towards something that's more utilitarian or job training, as opposed to, formation in the intellectual virtues or starting on the path towards wisdom. Is that built into the thinking for the CLT?
I mean, you think about the things that are said in mainstream ed schools in the country. And one of the things that's said a lot is that, it doesn't matter what students are reading as long as they're reading. Because reading is just understood by the failing mainstream educational complex as a skill. It's just a skill. Doesn't matter what they're doing, it's just a skill. Rather than, no, this is actually part of passing down an inheritance, a tradition,
Mm-hmm.
And so they removed language from kind of the grounding for it. They removed it from culture and from truth, and it just became this kind of vapid skill. And I think that's been the real problem and you see this reflected, right, on the way the SAT and ACT tests and the kinds of things they're putting in front of students. They're saying they're just trying to extract their ability to read a sentence, right? Because the longest sentence now on the SAT is 120 words, or the longest reading passage. The passages are as short as 25 words. And we're saying, well, that's actually not the thing we're trying to get at. The thing we're trying to get at is your ability to grapple with and understand the dense, complex kind of foundational text that built Western civilization, right? And carried it for 2,000 years. We're trying to get at that. And it turns out you can't get at that with a 25-word reading passage, which is what the College Board has reduced it to.
Well, it also just seems part of a general trend towards dumbing things down.
100%. And John, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I love to, you think about how companies normally compete against each other. Companies normally compete in two ways, right? They either are competing on price or they're competing on quality. So they get your business by offering something better at maybe a cheaper price, right? That's how companies compete. Well, how do the College Board and ACT compete? Well, the way they actually compete is by becoming dumber over time. Because if you're the dumber test, you're the easier way to admissions and to scholarship dollars. And so we've seen for well over half a century this kind of slow race to the bottom. And whichever test is easier has the market advantage, right?
Yeah.
And so even when I graduated high school in 2000, we were only seeing maybe a dozen perfect SATs a year. And now it's in the thousands, right?
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So the test has really become kind of meaningless to differentiate among top students.
Yeah, and that's part of a trend that's gone on for decades, and even in higher ed, where, you used to have, just the original disciplines, that were part of a university curriculum, where you're reading literature and philosophy, theology, mathematics, science. Now there's a proliferation of majors, and almost anything you could possibly think about studying, there's a class in the curriculum, and half the things are not serious at all, and the students get to decide, like, What do they want to
Yeah.
take?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It looks like if I take this basket weaving class, that's going to be an easy A.
Uh-huh.
And,
Yeah.
so you can pad your GPA
Yeah.
on kind of fluff courses. And
And this is to me is what makes TAC so different is like I would have very little interest. Not that it wouldn't matter, but just as an employer, I'm way more interested that they went to TAC than their actual GPA here, right? Because I know the kind of formation that happens. And I think grades have actually done immense damage in education. I mean, when I was a public school teacher, some of the students, I remember one of my top students I ever taught had like a 99 and would lose her mind if you marked anything wrong on anything. I don't think she liked school. I don't think she really loved learning. Like she was just obsessed with being
Yeah.
valedictorian or salutatorian.
Right.
And was
Right.
kind of angry all the time. You know, like that's not what we're doing. That's not what we
Right.
want. And I think when you have those kind of, and your students here, I mean, there were visitors today at TAC, you had students here articulating this so beautifully, right? That it's its own reward, right? The learning is its own reward. And then when you put
Yeah.
those false carrots in front of it, like grades, I think it can be a big distraction.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We really try to depress the focus on grades here. I mean, obviously we need grades. It's going to be a sign of progress and something you might need to use to get into graduate school, but it's not why you're doing it. And to be motivated by the grade is to take the shift away from truth and knowledge. It's not about truth and knowledge anymore. It's about credentialing. And
Totally. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I think we see that in higher ed more and more. Like, why are you going to Harvard? It's the credential.
Well, and I think this is that there's a lag time between like the educational formation and education they're getting and like the credential, right? And so right now Harvard still has the Harvard brand, but they're not offering anything like the kind of education they were offering really up until, towards the end of the 20th century. But they've still got the Harvard brand. And it takes some time to correct. But I think we're seeing that already. And again, I've hired, people from Princeton. I've hired people from Harvard. I've hired people from Hillsdale a lot, from TAC, from the University of Dallas. And like, I don't think anybody can compete with the kinds of students coming out of these kinds of colleges, just the really deep human formation, and I think this is really what it comes down to in this AI moment of like what it really means to be human is sharpened and highlighted, and even things that we can't really articulate. And I think it's going to matter more than ever that you're providing the kind of education here that really a machine can never replicate.
Yeah, the AI moment's a great occasion just to think about like what is really valuable in education, because as AI gets better and better, I mean, we're not even clear which jobs are going to be eliminated, but a lot of them are going to be eliminated. I mean, software engineering, it's been a huge number of layoffs.
Yeah.
I mean, you still need some software engineers. You need the creative ones that can use AI to help them code faster and more efficiently. But a lot of jobs are being eliminated. So
yeah,
what's left? You need to have a worker that can think critically, can think deeply, can communicate. So it seems like a liberal education actually is the more valuable.
I think so. And I was thinking about this, just like one of the industries that's getting pummeled right now in big ways, is the film industry, the movie industry. And, but I think what we're maybe already starting to see is a big uptick in a demand for actual theater, and at the end of the day, I don't think bots are ever going to be able to have like, the moment on the Titanic where Rose is sinking and Jack is sinking and letting go of Rose's hand, and everybody in the theater is crying like that. That's uniquely human,
Yeah.
And I think this also gets at the very difference between what is a teacher. If a teacher is somebody who's just there to basically download information, well, a bot can do that better.
Yeah.
But if a teacher is there to provide like an inspiring vision for the good life, a bot cannot do that.
Yeah. Right. No, I mean, not only can that, if you talk about inspiring, you need a teacher that has a kind of personal relationship, right? The kind of friendship that can help. So you attract them not just because of the content, but also the fact that you're studying and learning together. You're part of a larger tradition, and that seems like it requires kind of one-on-one face-to-face connectedness. That's one of the things I think about. If our program, we have all of our classes are discussion based, like small Socratic seminars.
Yeah.
It seems like that face-to-face experience is getting slowly eliminated because all these kids are on chatbots. I mean, they're revealing very intimate secrets to these chatbots, almost using them as artificial, persons, as friends.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I think just what's really going to be needed is a real human connection, real human friendship, and that's a big part of teaching, right?
That's right. That's 100% right. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the industries that people didn't expect with the release of like the first few iterations of chat, is that like things like therapy and counseling would be so heavily impacted.
Right.
But we are seeing that, and it's happening just so fast that a lot of young people, some of whom they've grown up with this, they've been so saturated in this that they've never had a chance to make like real human friends,
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the things that, so I remember I was up at Wyoming Catholic for the first time visiting, and I realized after being there for a couple of hours, I'm like, what is up with these students? Like they were just kind of different, and I was trying to put my finger on it. And like they're just less fidgety and like seeming less anxious, and they seem more present and talking to each other and more dialed into the lesson. And I was like, oh yeah, like they don't get a phone here,
Right.
And they seemed almost like a different kind of species a little bit. Like they were just like they were just there, like they were
Yeah.
grounded and not just like having half of their brain fragmented into the virtual world.
No, that's so important. I mean, don't go quite as far as Wyoming Catholic, but we don't have any devices in our classrooms, no cell phones. They're not allowed to bring them in the class.
I was off the grid when I got here. I realized that when I tried to check some emails, like, oh, they're not messing around at CAC.
Yeah, in fact, our because of the rule where they're not allowed to bring their phones into class, you'll see outside the classrooms these phones piled up, like on benches, in flower pots, and we try to keep them out of all our meals too, like the dining hall. Cell phones aren't allowed.
Yeah,
and I think in the end, the students appreciate that. Like they can see that it's making their friendships better.
Yeah.
It's making them more connected, and yeah, it's one of the real downsides of the technology. I mean, the smartphones are so powerful that, and they're designed to have you scroll endlessly.
Yeah,
It's such a temptation. I find myself, you start looking at a news story and you're scrolling from one story to the next. And, but it's just drawing you away from real human connectedness.
we're all Frodo now. We're all Frodo.
Right.
We've all got the ring in our pocket, and it's controlling us. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I was even just thinking, it seems like there are positive sides to AI that will make certain industries more efficient, better. But does this seem right? The most creative users of AI are going to be the ones that have an education without it. That is, an AI-free education is going to be the one that the student who can think critically, can think independently, is already grounded, has some sense of first principles. Once you're grounded in that way, you can make a better use of AI than someone who maybe has always relied on it as a kind of a crutch.
I think that's right.
too?
And but again, I think it's changed so fast. So even again, the first iterations of ChatGPT 1, I remember a lot of people were saying, well, it can come up with some paragraphs, but it can't write beautiful poetry, right?
Yeah.
And now you can say, hey, Chat, write me a poem about John Goyette in the style of William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And it's wild,
it is
what
crazy.
it
It's
comes
crazy.
up with, at the time. So I think we don't know, and we didn't know this. We didn't know the consequences with a lot of things that have come out of the past few decades. We didn't know the consequences of social media. We found out after years, of like, oh wow, depression for teenage girls especially went crazy.
Yeah.
When Instagram became an iPhone app that they could have and scroll all the time and compare their life to everybody else's, right? It took us a few years to understand how we were going to be negatively impacted. And so I think that given a new technology, there's always some damage that happens. We don't know where. We know we're going to pay for it probably somewhere. I think right now is a moment for caution. We don't want to be Luddites, but at the same time, I think we do want to be I think caution is wise at this moment right now as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, to give students a grounding without it, where they're not totally dependent on this as well. I think they will be, at the end of the day, the best users of it as well.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I guess it's a little hard to know exactly where it's going to go, what the impact will be. But I guess we've seen enough. I mean, I've talked to businessmen, employers, board members, who say that they've really noticed a difference when they interview candidates for a job, that they noticed a difference starting a few years ago, basically at the time that ChatGPT was adopted and became readily available. They've noticed the kids graduating from college are different. Like they can't carry on a conversation. There's more dependency. Like they've used ChatGPT or some other chatbot to do most of their homework, to write their reading assignments.
Yeah.
Actually, I wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal on AI and education, and it was largely fueled by hearing a story that a professor at Stanford had said. Everyone at Stanford says this is a huge problem. All these kids are cheating. We don't know what to do about it. And so I think it's really widespread. Now I think it's bringing back good old college blue books for handwritten exams.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's already showing the negative impact, at least in education.
Yeah. And it's the reason we don't. I mean, if you graduate from TAC, UD, Benedictine, one of these kinds of schools, you're going to get an interview at CLT for sure, But I honestly, I'm not just saying this. I mean, we sometimes view it as a liability. Somebody applies with a state university degree, and that doesn't signal great things at the current moment, right? We've got the confidence in a place like TAC that real formation is still happening, and that they're holding a line to not make these kids, dependent on these kind of devices. Mm-hmm. And I do think, that we have no idea what the jobs are going to look like in 5 or 10 years, right? But I think we do know the kind of people that we're going to want to be hiring in 5 or 10 years. And they're self-controlled, they're disciplined, they do right by their employer, they don't lie. I'm pretty positive that's going to be the case, right?
Right.
And so why wouldn't we make it the business of education to produce people like that? Because it's kind of the only constant. And so I think in that sense, I'm in some ways optimistic about the way AI is going to almost create a market force to push education maybe back in a TAC kind of first principles direction.
Yeah, so you're thinking actually it'll self-correct because people are going to realize the problem and therefore start to value like classical education, great books.
I think it's happening. I think we're watching it happen right now in real time. Because teachers are having to say that they know the students aren't writing the papers, right? Yeah. And the parents know that the teachers aren't grading the papers, right?
Right, yeah.
You've got AI written papers graded by AI.
Right, no.
It's absolute insanity.
No, it is. It is crazy, yeah. And I have heard that, from talking to different people I know at other universities and colleges, that there's the popularity of in-class essays is growing because you can't fake that. Like here's a blue book, here's a pen, you write the essay now. You don't have AI in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah, in some ways, I think that might dovetail nicely with, I was going to ask you about, it seems like from talking to people about the kind of program we have here, like Friends of the College, that more and more people are recognizing the value of classical education. And I was thinking, wondering whether you thought we're kind of in a Renaissance moment, which kind of dovetails with this idea that AI is actually going to bring to the fore the need for liberal education. But I wonder, do you have the optimism, or do you share that optimism?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on at the same time. When you picture the scenarios where you've woken up and it's just pitch black, and you're trying to get a sense of like where you're at. You're looking for any kind of familiar reference point to know where the rest of the room is at and whatnot, right? And I think that this AI massive crazy digital revolution that's happened so quickly has made people, even just look at the shows that have been a big hit on things like Netflix and HBO and whatever. Most of them are like historical fiction, things like Outlander. People are so starving for some kind of rootedness that they feel like they're just floating in space. Like they're disconnected geographically and relationally from their own ancestors, their own culture, their own traditions, and they're kind of starving for that. And so I think in that sense, like classical education comes along and reintroduces people to a tradition that they know, okay, this is how, my ancestors were educated in this tradition. Oh, this educational tradition, the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem and Rome, these shape the foundations of Western civilization. So I think there is a widespread desire for an education that kind of gives us our bearings, to go back to that analogy of the dark room. And we're seeing this across. I mean, it's on the homeschool side, but it's impacting higher ed in a big way. A lot of the top universities right now, University of Florida, Chapel Hill, Ohio State, University of Colorado, they're all launching kind of colleges within the college that are civics and classical education colleges, right? Kind of a university within the university.
Right.
And students, and they're very, very popular with students. So I think absolutely we're seeing a huge demand. My dad, he's big into lifting weights, and he'd always tell me, I worked out before, working out was cool. And I think of that when I think of TAC, right? Like in the early 1970s, people weren't doing this. But now everybody knows mainstream education is totally broken, right? It's designed to give people jobs that don't really exist and are not going to exist in a few years, right? Whereas TAC is doing the hard work of forming a whole person in the right ways, to love the right things, to treat people in the right ways. And again, I think that's what's going to be really lasting.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you mentioned Jerusalem and Athens and Rome, which made me think about another question I want to ask you about. I was thinking about, the CLT test is obviously meant to be pitched to a broad audience. Kids in public school, kids in private school, charter schools, homeschool kids. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about if education at its highest aims towards wisdom, and if wisdom in its fullness or entirety includes faith, what do you do about faith and reason in the context of the CLT test? That is to say, if you're trying to reach a broad audience, do you still think about the test as open toward transcendent truth? I mean, does that question make sense? In other words,
yeah,
how does faith and reason come
I
into
think
the test?
a starting point for that, and this is how I think about what CLT is trying to do and to recover, is that, really before compulsory education laws, before the Industrial Revolution, in America, it was also this way in much of Europe. If you would have gone into a school, consider you a Christian school or even a Catholic school, they might have been a bit confused, actually, right? There wasn't even a self-conscious awareness. Christianity was so baked into the fabric of the culture that they would have been like, yes, right?
Right.
Even my grandmother just passed a few months ago. She was 99 years old. She was born in 1926. She grew up in Big Springs and Midland, Texas. I said, what do you remember from elementary school, public elementary school, 1930s? She remembers copying scripture and memorizing
Really?
scripture, right? I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do is trying to challenge, I think there's this hysteria, like separation of church and state, separation of church and state. I don't think any of the founders ever imagined an America that was biblically illiterate, right? Which is what we are. In fact, John Adams, as you know, said that the Constitution was only intended for a moral and religious people, right? And so I think we want to normalize the kinds of text. We don't have scripture on the CLT, but I'm not totally close to it either. I think for me, it's more about a question of reverence towards scripture. We have theology on the CLT. We have philosophy on the CLT. You might see St. Thomas on the CLT. And if that can awaken a student up, and a lot of these students, you imagine, theology goes from the queen of the sciences in the universities for centuries to go to most college campuses in California and ask the first student you see, what is theology?
Right.
And you say, what is what?
Right.
They've never heard the word before.
It's not only not the queen of the sciences, it's not even there. It's kind of relegated to, it's been exiled. Yeah, so I think, I take what you're saying to be saying that, listen, if truth is one and faith and reason harmonize, then there has to be a place for it. And I even think, I don't know if you think this is true, but even those who are not necessarily believers, but they see what's happening to education, that Western civilization is getting lost or forgotten. That even if they're not believers, when they see in our Western civilization the danger to Western civilization being lost, they see that there's a kind of a foundation rooted in the church, rooted in theology,
Yeah.
so that it's finally a friend of education. I mean, even if they don't share the faith.
Yeah. Yeah. A few years ago, it was a few years ago now, maybe it was 2019 or so, Howard University was canning its classics department. They're getting rid of it. And one of my friends, Dr. Anika Prather, so Howard's an all Black, HBCU university. And I ended up writing an op-ed with Cornell West about covering this story, right? This op-ed made it all the way onto The View with Whoopi Goldberg and the
Really?
ladies at The View talking about this. And it was so interesting. There's old ladies, they're in their 70s or something. And they were all talking about how much they valued like their core curriculum that they had back in, because they went in the 60s before the core had really been destroyed. So it used to be the case that if you wanted to or not, you were going to take, Western Civ, you were going to take philosophy. And so that created a common ground, like it created a common foundation to at least be able to argue well, right? We had some of the same stories, some of the same assumptions. And I really think the moment we're seeing right now in our nation of just like the breakdown of just civility, I think it comes from this miseducation, and that we don't have common stories. We don't have a common canon. We don't have shared first principles, right?
Right.
And I think that the only way, maybe, right, to save the republic is to re-embrace classical education just as education.
Yeah, it's not one brand of education. It's the real deal.
Exactly.
Everything else is just a falling away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, I mean, even just, it kind of first started with the elective system, and maybe you can make a certain amount of sense out of it. Well, it may be good to add a few classes on, but then over time, it just shifts the whole aim of education towards what do students want to take classes on, not what should they take classes on.
Yeah.
Let's let them decide. It's like a smorgasbord. You decide what you want to take. And then of course the shift towards credentialing and job training. It's just over time. Sometimes those cumulative changes are necessary to see, where are we at, and to kind of correct and go back.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I think that we're going back right now, and it's because of some of the things that sometimes we complain about, social media, that we can do it, I think, faster than anybody thought possible, right? And so I often try to use the analogy of like organic milk, where we use the term organic milk to really just describe what used to be milk for all of history, but once they started to pump it full of toxins, we needed to introduce the modifier organic. That's all we mean by this term classical education, right? It's just trying to describe education as it was before it kind of got hijacked by radical progressives in the early 20th century. But I think parents are waking up, and I think the best case for this kind of education, I think, is just had a chance to meet your daughter today, who was lovely. It's meeting the young people who are receiving this kind of education. And this was my experience. I didn't know the first thing about classical education 15 years ago. I was working at a church. I had 4 groups of students. So I had students that were in the public school, students that were homeschooled, students in a Christian school, and then students in this classical Christian school. I didn't know anything. But I did know the students in the classical Christian school were really, really different. Like, they were mature, they were well-spoken, they were unabashedly interested in learning and not embarrassed about it, And so I think it is, every parent wants the best for their kids. And I think that parents are more and more going to be demanding, classical. So I think the future is going to be very bright. We're going to see a lot of crazy disruption happening over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I share that optimism, although, some days are better than others, but, but overall, it just seems like we are rebounding, and people are appreciating, what's been lost and trying to reclaim it, recover it. And, I mean, that's what we've been doing here since the beginning, but it seems like it's kind of building momentum. So I wonder, you were really gracious today to come and speak to a group of legates from the Legata Summit, and you were telling us a little bit about what's in store in the future for the CLT. Like maybe you want to tell us a little bit, where's the CLT going? What's
Yeah.
next?
That's great. So the big focus over the next few years is going to be launching an alternative both to the International Baccalaureate and then advanced placement. And so the College Board, of course, owns and operates the advanced placement courses and the tests as well. I think any student, taking AP US, AP Lit. I mean, think about just something like AP Lit for a second. I read the reading list for AP Lit. They have one Catholic on who's like quasi Shakespeare. It's quasi-closet Catholic, I guess, because he lived in a weird moment, right?
Yeah.
But we've got all of the best authors, all from Augustine to Dante to Boethius to Flannery O'Connor to Tolkien. And how? And AP Lit, in favor of, global perspectives and global authors, we completely neglect the very best literary tradition the world has ever known, which is the Catholic literary tradition. And so, yeah, we're launching an alternative to AP Lit, AP Lang, AP US, AP World, AP Government. And then we're also building an alternative to IB. So IB is in a lot of the schools, International Baccalaureate. They offer a whole IB diploma. So really coming out of the state legislature in Florida, there's been a real demand for an alternative to IB. IB likes to use the language of global citizenship, which makes a lot of people want to throw up. They're not big fans of that. Right. And so what we're into is not global citizenship, but becoming, sons and daughters of this great Western Christian Catholic intellectual inheritance. And that's what we have a job of passing that along to the next generation, even though for a lot of us it wasn't properly passed on to us. We're recovering this thing that was almost lost, and I view doing this at the institutional level, right, is in some ways building kind of like the crucial infrastructure that we're going to need for classical to be able to really scale. We can't scale it so long as we're using the measuring stick set by the failing progressive educational marketplace.
So to say just a little bit more about your own AP Lit, your own AP Government, your own, and the baccalaureate program. So that's more than just designing a test. It means designing a curriculum that goes with an AP literature. Or
that's right. So a lot of students take an AP test without taking the AP class. Homeschool students have found ways to do that. A lot of classical schools don't offer the AP class because they don't want the students ingesting all of the College Board nonsense. Mm-hmm. But if they want to rack up some AP points and some credits, they'll still let them take the AP test if they want, right? So we're talking about kind of two different things. Enduring courses, it's kind of a misnomer because enduring courses really just refers to the test. And so what we want this to be is basically non-prescriptive. We're not, we're going into existing Catholic schools or classical schools and saying, you're doing a great job. What if in lieu of your final, or maybe in addition to it, there was another exam that you could take that would also be good for credit at this growing list of colleges and universities? So that's enduring courses, and we're trying to respond to concerns that AP has been at times heavy-handed and too prescriptive. At the same time, there's a demand coming for essentially a classical track within existing public school districts. And so as school districts more and more are starting to lose to Founder and Valor and Great Hearts and some of these classical charter school networks, they want to be able to offer an alternative track that is classical. So there's been a real demand. So we're kind of launching these two things simultaneously. And it's an exciting time.
Yeah. Okay. So it's more primarily the test, but it has an implied curriculum that goes with it, or at least an openness to great classic literature, for instance.
That's right. Yeah. The classical baccalaureate, similar to the international baccalaureate program, will be prescriptive, will have a curriculum, at least at the high school level, possibly going down even into middle school or grade schools as well. And that's where there's been, the movement as a whole, there's a lot of energy. But there's also, we're running into real scaling problems, right? What are the problems? Well, the problems are, one, teachers. Every school wants teachers that went to Thomas Aquinas College. They can't hire them fast enough, right? None of these classical schools want teachers coming out of the ed schools. In fact, some of the best classical schools in the country, they view teacher license or a state certificate as a liability, not as an asset, right? They just want a Hillsdale degree. They just want a Thomas Aquinas College degree, right? They want a UD degree. That's what really conveys, oh, they've been formed in this tradition, and therefore they may be able to help pass it on to others as well, right?
Yeah.
So we need to build some of this crucial kind of infrastructure up. We think a big part of this is going to be providing more ways for students to receive this education, even within the existing public school districts.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So here's a question I have for you that I wonder about. I guess I wonder generally about classical schools that are putting great literature in front of their students, and maybe would apply to the CLT. I'm not sure, but I find sometimes you have kids that are reading great texts that they're really not ready for, and I wonder, is this something you thought about? Because I think about if I want a kid in high school to read Dickens, like great, read it. Sometimes you get really, really heavy books or very difficult philosophy texts that they're maybe not quite ready for. And I'm wondering, here at the college, we have an idea of not just reading great books, but having a definite order to our curriculum. Like you don't read metaphysics first. That comes at the end of 4 years. And so there's an order to the way you study things. And I wonder, have you given any thought to that question about what books and what texts are appropriate for kids, say, at the high school level, and what books are maybe better saved for college? Or, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
So this is really interesting, and I'd love for you to guess first. The profile for this student that does the best on the CLT. Are they Catholic school, classical school, homeschooled? What would you guess?
I don't know. I mean,
so it's interesting.
Yeah,
it's actually
question.
homeschool independent. They actually have the highest average score. So they're homeschool students that are actually not part of an umbrella group. Now, there's great reasons to be part of umbrella groups, and those schools, they actually do way better than a lot of other groups as well. But at the very highest tier is homeschool totally independent. And in fact, the only student to ever get a perfect 120 on the CLT, this young man named Matthew Tolbert. He got a perfect 120. We've had well over 500,000 test takers, one perfect score. And so I get on the phone with Matthew and congratulate him and tell me about school. Like I said, what do you mean? I've always been homeschooled. Never had any concept of grades at all. He actually didn't know grades were even a thing until high school.
Really?
He said all of life was learning and learning was life. And that was the adventure that I was on, and so who knows a child better than their mom and dad? I've got 6 kids, not as many as your 9. My fifth one is learning to read right now. He's not anywhere nearly as advanced as my second oldest, daughter. He's in a different place, And so for him, and I know the kind of stuff he's into. I mean, he's super into animals, right? And so I think that especially a younger education that can be really crafted around a love for the student, knowing the student. I think it's the reason why so many TAC students were homeschooled growing up. They come here with a very solid formation, and then it's amped up and kind of perfected at TAC. But yeah, that's interesting to me in terms of how I think about that question, because I don't think it's one size fits all or that it should be prescriptive. But you do have right now a lot of millions of students. They're being miseducated in our schools. I mean, this was a big deal just this past week. Texas released their new state reading list, okay, for all the grades. It's what you would see at any classical school. It's Dante, it's Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, they're reading Animal Farm. I mean, it is what any good classical school would have, right? They're going to have the challenge of a teacher that is going to be capable of kind of passing on this tradition. But what we're seeing is widespread kind of market response to people fleeing in some ways, kind of the existing public schools. And I think they've been put in a situation where they can either keep bleeding students or they can reform. and the direction of reform is very clear, which is around a traditional or kind of classical model.
Yes, you're saying it's all going to depend on the student. Some student might be ready for a text that another student's not. And so there's not really a one size fits all.
I think especially in the younger years. Especially in the younger years, that's the case. I mean, I think you're probably admitting students into TAC that have maybe had a very different track up to that point, but when they get here, they're ready to do a similar, and you think about the culture that happens at a place like TAC or UD, where students are struggling through the same texts and classes together. It actually kind of gives birth to a really real friendship. And I think it's really interesting for me to look at what happens, at a place like St. John's or TAC, just in terms of the campus culture, But I don't think you can do that at a first or second grade level, I think that the students have to reach a certain maturity and that there should be more differentiation, not less, at the lower grades.
Yeah, okay. Do you also run into this? It seems like you have sometimes the thought, I think some students that go through a classical education, say for elementary school or high school, they think, well, okay, I've read the great books.
Yeah.
Like I'm done. I don't really need to do it because I've read Dante, I've read Shakespeare. And I'm wondering, I have my own thoughts about that. I'm thinking, you're just scratching the surface for these books. Most of the books we read in our program, you could read many times and still profit from them. And as a teacher in our program, I've experienced that firsthand. You get reading Dante for the fourth or fifth time, and you're seeing new things. If you were trying to persuade a high school kid who's had a classical education program where they're reading great texts, who says, I've done that great books thing, like now I'm going to go to Harvard, or I'm going to go to Princeton, or I'm going to go to the state school and get a credential or a degree that's practical, what would you say to them?
Well, it's a conversation happening in almost every classical school across the country right now. And it's very, very common. A student says, I don't want to go to any of these great flagship programs that we could name, TAC, I think, being at the forefront of those, because they feel like they've already done it, right?
Yeah.
I've already done that, exactly. And a lot of them go off to major in things that sometimes surprise people, that a lot of the kids coming out of classical schools go into various STEM fields and that sort of thing. But I do think that that also might be changing right now, and I think that young people are really concerned. I was talking to a young man the other day. He's at the Naval Academy. And one of the reasons he's excited to get there as a freshman is because he's concerned about the future of work, But I think they're also very receptive to this argument that, well, we don't know what it's going to look like. But we do know the kinds of people that we think are going to be really desirable for employers, and that this kind of education forms those kinds of people, So I think young people are scared of the future. I think that they're scared of the changes that AI may or may not bring. But I think there's a lot of wisdom saying, okay, because we don't know so much, let's stick with the tried and true, for your education. I think that would be the kind of advice I'd want to pass on.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you mentioned you have 6 kids. How old is your oldest?
Oldest is 19, Grace. She's a political science major. She's at James Madison University, running track and cross country there.
Okay, great. Yeah. When are we going to get one of your kids to TAC?
I need to. The next one is looking at Coast Guard, maybe Catholic.
Okay.
I think she's going to be an East Coast one, but there's 4 more after that. So
okay, all right. We still have a chance.
That's right. That's right. I would love that for sure.
So, okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Jeremy, thanks so much for coming today and speaking to our guests and coming on our podcast. It's really been great having you. And
oh, John, thanks so much for the invitation. I really do. This is such a special place, and I'm just amazed by the students I get to meet when I come out here and the formation they're receiving. And I think TAC in many ways is a beacon in a dark time in many ways for higher ed. I think people are starting to look more and more like, what are they doing there? And they're seeing hope, right? They're seeing what it can be. And I think it's so important that there's those real, physically real examples that can show people, hey, this is what we can do still. So Thank you for what you've done here as a tutor and now as director of advancement.
Yeah, well, great. So thanks for coming.